Hello, Old Timer here with Section 1, Part 2, The Last Barefoot Generation. A story about kids growing up during the Great Depression in the Deep South. I was 9 when the war started with Japan, and the 9 years of my life was all during the Great Depression. After we got electricity, my dad bought a small radio, and he would listen to the only station he could get, where he heard about the soup lines up north in the big cities where thousands of people were going hungry because they had no way to get money. They said all the factories was closed and all the banks and everything. I didn't understand much of what was going on, but I knew that we wasn't hungry because we always had food. And like in the spring and summer, we had basket after basket of all kind of fresh vegetables and fruit, and we had chickens that we could butcher and eat. We also had plenty of eggs all the time. We had fresh tomatoes and beans and peas and corn that we made. We fed to the animals, as well as we ground it up and made cornmeal and grits. We had cantaloupe and squash and cucumbers and watermelons and peaches. And in the fall, we had pears and plums. And when it began to get cold weather, my dad would go hunting and kill deer and turkey. And we had plenty of fresh venison, they call it today, deer meat. And we also grew sugar cane, and in the colder winter months, well, in the fall, we'd make syrup and molasses, and we always had lots of big jars of it stored away in the old pantry. Some of it had been there so long it had sugar in the bottom of it. And around October every year, when it started getting cold, my dad and everybody around us always butchered some of their hogs. So we always had smoked hog hams and country bacon and all the fresh and smoked sausage we could eat. And we were right there near the coast, and we had all kind of fish from fresh water and brackish water and salt water. And in the spring, my dad would go with a special net and catch shrimp. And we always had boatloads of mullet and small speckled trout and other kind of brackish and saltwater fish. And in the winter time, we could go and get boatloads of oysters. And then when it got into the wartime, we had people coming around from the government wanting to buy food from us, and they'd make a list of whatever, how many animals we had, and this and that and the other, and want us to sell them so many hogs or a cow or two or whatever. They especially wanted to buy all the lard we made, because they said that was a very important item for the war effort. The problem with that was, at that time, everybody used lard to do the cooking, to do the frying and so forth. And we also had problems during the war with people coming from the city in the early morning hours, usually on the weekends, climbing over our fence along the dirt road and stealing whatever they could get. One Sunday morning, some of them city men came along the dirt road and shot one of our hogs, and 2 or 3 of them jumped over the fence and grabbed the hog and threw him back over the fence. And then they got over and grabbed and run to the car on the dirt road and threw him in there and took off. We heard it all going on because the dogs ran out that way barking, and my dad went out there and found blood on the ground in the dirt road where they had loaded the hog in the car. My dad thought that it was all happening because the government was rationing everything. In other words, the government was limiting what food items and anything any one person or a family could buy. And a lot of city folks was having it hard, he thought, living on just what they could buy, even though they had money. The government was issuing all the families what they call ration books, and it had stamps in it, and each stamp represented what item that you could buy. and you had to have the money and the stamp. That if you didn't have the stamp, you couldn't buy the item. So that was why some people wasn't being able to get what they wanted all the time. And the government, they give big families, they give more stamps in the book to make up for more people in the family. It was called rationing stamps. Some of our kin on my mom's side told her that some of the men coming stealing animals weren't just family men trying to feed the family, but they were just thieves that was going around and taking orders for different food items like hams off of a hog, or ribs, or pork bellies, or whatever, and cows, the steak off the cows and everything. They take orders for all that stuff. And then they'd come out in the country, maybe our way, and they'd steal the animal and take him somewhere and butcher him. And then they'd put it on ice and go around and deliver the parts that they'd already took orders to sell. She said that everybody was talking about the black market, and some people were making a lot of money, but the police were looking for them. My family also got rationing books of stamps in the mail every so often, but we never used any except my dad bought coffee and salt with some, and my mom, she usually gave the rest to some of our relatives on her side that lived in the city. Later, I found out that it was illegal. I don't think my mama ever knew it was, but maybe her relatives in the city knew it was, but they didn't bother to tell her. My mom never went to a grocery store until I was near out of high school. And I remember, I think this was, the war was already over, I think, and she went to the grocery store with my dad and come back with a box of Cheerios. That was the first time I ever saw such a thing as cereal. As us kids grew older, we started using our parents' small rowboats and went up and down the creeks, and especially the river that went to the ocean. And we learned to catch red bass, spot-tail bass we call them sometimes, and sea trout, and sometimes striped bass that we call rockfish. We also learned how to pick the best oysters in the winter, and a couple of times some of us kids went down there to the salt water, to the ocean, to the where the oyster beds were, and we loaded up a couple of boats with oysters and went back. It was during Thanksgiving holidays when all the kids were out of school, and we went back and with loads of oysters and surprised everybody, and we had a big oyster roast I think 2 years in a row, and all the neighbors came, and we all had a good time. Another thing that we learned was around the edges of the marshes, alligator mothers would build nests out of mud and marsh grass and lay a pile of eggs in them. Somebody said that there was a man coming around asking to buy alligator eggs and little alligators, and they said that he told them that he had a tourist attraction for northern tourists on their way to Florida, to Miami Beach or somewhere. And he kind of left word that if anybody knew somebody that would get the eggs or catch baby gators, he'd come around and buy them. And little Fred was at the station one day, and the man happened to come up and start talking about it. And little Fred got in a conversation with him, and they made a deal about him coming back, and we're going to try to get some gators for him. Anyway, so we started going down there to the creek where we knew there was a big alligator nest across on the other side of the creek. And we went down there just before dark and put our rowboats in the water and started drifting around. And sure enough, the little baby alligators was already in the creek, floating up and drowning, up and down, and making little grunting sounds every few minutes. We had these little lights with straps that you could put over your head, and we'd have two people in a rowboat, and one kneeling down in the front and the other one paddling real quiet. And the one in the front would get to shine the light of the eyes of a little baby gator and hold him, and we'd slowly paddle up there, and then the one kneeling down in the front would grab the little gator back of the head and throw him in the boat. And And we had, that first night we went, we caught 24 alligators. And by the time the man come back, we had 42 baby gators in a big 55 open top drum. We had a few inches of water in it. And we found out that we could drop big grasshoppers into the drum, and them little baby gators would snap them right up and swallow them. We got $60 cash for the 42 gators, $10 a piece. Joseph, he never, at night, his mama wouldn't let him go off with us if we were going in the river, because she was afraid he couldn't swim good enough, so he didn't get all that money. When I graduated from high school the next year, I paid for my class ring with money I got selling baby gators. Around where I grew up, nobody was looked at as rich or poor, even though some families had a lot more land than others did. Everybody did about the same thing, though. That was small gardening and farming and raising pigs and cows and chickens and killing deer in the fall and the winter, like I said, and turkey, and going fishing and oystering and so forth, and they all, that's the way everybody got their food. And scattered around the country dirt road that I lived on, there was black folks and white folks. And three of my mom's friends was Rosa and Eddie. I think her name was Henrietta, but everybody called her Etta, and Hattie. My friend Josie was one of Hattie's boys. Rosa was the midwife I mentioned earlier. Now, I'm not saying that there wasn't segregation or discrimination going on, because there was. In the bigger town closest to us, the water fountain said whites only. And as a teenager, when I went over to that little town with my daddy, you could hear people say that blacks, they called them the N-word, had to be kept in their place. But in the community where I grew up, I never heard of any kind of problem ever between the black and the white people, the people we called colored people. Like I said, Joseph was my close friend, and I also knew a lot of other black kids on a first name basis. A lot of times we went over and we all played together as a group and whatever. We all got along good. And when we were in the springtime or whatever, when we were doing something that required a lot of help, like planting a big field or something, our neighbors, if they wasn't real busy, they'd come over and they'd help us plant or whatever. And my daddy, he'd go over and help them carry his plow horse over or whatever if they needed help. And anytime then, like we planted a big field of corn, and it was time for what we call roasting the ears to be broke off the stalks, we'd carry bucket loads of them all around to the people that helped. And it was like that, kind of share and share alike. If we went fishing or oystering and got a load, we always carried some around to our neighbors, black and white, and they always did the same. We butchered our hogs in our place, and they helped us. And then on the day they were going to butcher their hogs, we would go and help them. They smoked the hogs they butchered in their smokehouses, and we smoked ours in ours, because it was a night and day job keeping a fire going and smoking the meat and so forth after we butchered the hogs. Many summer days, my sisters and mom sat on our long front porch and shelled butter beans and peas with Hattie and Etta and Rosa. And when they finished, they divided up everything they'd done equal shares. It was like that. People were just people. That was the idea I grew up with. Now, it's true that they ate opossum, we called them possums, and they ate raccoons, we called them coons, and we didn't, but they said they were good to eat, and that was all right with me. Let me tell you a little more about the lives of some of the black people who lived around us. Our neighbors and friends, all the white people around, called them colored people, and some of those colored people called white men honkies, because they carried a handkerchief around in the back pocket of their overalls and was all the time taking it out and blowing their nose. everybody knew that everybody called that whatever, colored folks or honkies. Everybody on both sides knew it, and it wasn't a big deal. But anyway, back before the war between the states, there was evidently quite a few rice and indigo growing plantations up and down near where I lived. They plant the rice in the fields that they made out of the marsh land, and they plant the indigo, which was made into a dye up in what they call the upland. My dad didn't know if this family had ever owned slaves. He actually didn't know how long it had been since the Civil War, the war between the states, because he only got to go to the 4th grade because that was all the school it was when he came up. But after they got married, my mama taught him to read really good, and he could do all kind of math. He knew everything. He knew the times tables, and he knew how to add and subtract and so forth. And he could, good carpenter, he could cut angles and everything. He said that his dad never mentioned anything about where there were slaves and where they owned slaves. I know slave labor had to have been used to dig all those canals and doing all the work, growing all that rice and so forth, because everybody knew that the English sailing ships come up there in the river, because there was old dock, still parts of it left there, where they loaded that rice and the indigo. Well, they said they did that for over 100 years in the rice fields. I say our rice fields because I inherited some of them from my dad. I also know that a lot of houses and little farms that the black folks owned around where we lived were once a part of the land that belonged to one of my grandpas a few generations back. From what I've grown up to believe is that after the war between the states, some freed slaves did leave the area, but a lot stayed right where they were, and the situation I was born into gradually came into being, where everybody, as the generations passed, just fell into growing as much food as they could and raising hogs and cows and fishing and hunting. In other words, just working to get by, as they still say around there today. Evidently, working together on big jobs made it easier on everyone, and sharing what was produced became an informal way of seeing to that everybody had something always. In other words, nobody went hungry. Of course, as a kid, I didn't think about things like that, but from my earliest memories, it made for a feeling of belonging for me. I'm going to end this video now. I will continue a little later with part 3. Thank you for listening.